I have been hearing a lot of people throwing around the we should separate art from the artist argument recently, and I'm tired of it. Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. Welcome back if you've been here. If you haven't been here before, my name is Cameron. I make videos about books and reading and a lot of stuff like that. And I did in fact see that Vulture article about Neil Gaiman. I also, for the purpose of a future video, am rereading Harry Potter. You might be thinking, now what do these two things have in common? Well, I've been hearing both about Neil Gaiman and J.K. Rowling for a while now. I've heard a, well, I'm choosing to separate the art from the artist argument, which, you know, that is a phrase you can use. I don't know if it's a correct one for the scenario, but it is a phrase you can use. So, if any of you, like myself, were former very big Neil Gaiman fans, or former big Harry Potter fans, or whatever, I want you to know that you are not alone, but I also want to make sure we are being correct in our definitions. So today, I've made a little graph for you about what scenarios can you realistically separate the art from the artist. So, yeah, down below I am going to attach a PDF of that article, of the Neil Gaiman article. Please take care of yourself. There's a lot of very horrific things that occur in that article regarding the allegations about Neil Gaiman. So please take care of yourself. A lot of the trigger warning things are things I literally cannot bring up here on YouTube. So, but if you want to know what I'm referencing, it is linked down below. So what we are doing today, I'm so glad you all are here. I made a little baby simple 6-question kind of chart for you about the scenarios that you can separate art from the artist. In the scenario, you can separate the written works from the author. Because this is a book account, I'm going to talk about books and writing, but I do think this chart is applicable for any type of art, whether it's a director, a film writer, a physical artist, like someone who paints on a canvas. Like, this is an applicable graph for that. But like I said, all of the examples I'm going to be using today are going to be like examples from the literary world. So yeah, first, before I start like telling you these things, the numbers on here are the questions that I'm going to ask. I'll explain to you what these questions are as video kind of continues on and everything. So we'll go over those questions later. Pink arrows indicate answers of I don't know. Green arrows, I don't know if you can even see the green arrows. Whatever, I'll put it up on the screen. I also think I'm gonna make and attach a PDF of this chart so that you can actually reference it and you don't have to fight the glare on this whiteboard. But regardless, the green ones are if you answered yes to the question, and the blue ones are if you answered no to the questions. And then I'll tell you the conclusions that everyone can come to. This is a very basic graph. I made it pretty quickly. I made it this morning. So if I am missing any questions you guys feel are valuable to ask when you're doing this, oh my gosh, the clouds just covered the sun. If I don't ask any questions you guys feel are relevant to this scenario, please let me know. Please let me know in the comments. Please let me know one that I should and could include, and I would be happy to do that. None of the questions also are about personal feelings, because personal feelings do not indicate whether you can separate an art from its artist. So a lot of people who like come and they're like, well, yeah, J.K. Rowling's a bad person, but like I'm choosing to separate the art from the artist because I love the book series. No, that's not how this works. You all know, if you've been here for a while, that I pretty regularly post videos and square up with like people who still support J.K. Rowling, and like, no, that's not the space for this. If you're gonna come into my comments and argue why your problematic fave should be a scenario where you separate the art from the artist, spoiler alert, there's not a lot of scenarios where you can like do that. So I think that's all I've got for the intro. So why don't we kind of go through these questions and talk about each of them. So the very first question that you should be asking yourself, obviously it branches off into a bunch of different paths, but the very first question that you should be asking yourself is, does the work that you are reading and or does the author say things about specific individuals or people groups that is harmful. So that's kind of the very first scenario that we should talk about. And also, this is not a graph of like, is this person good or bad? This is actually not relevant to can you separate the writing from the author. That's genuinely, it's not relevant if the person is a good person or not. Because there are good scenarios where you still can't separate the writing from the author. And I will give you guys some examples as we're like going through this chart. But the first one is, does the written work or the author say bad things about individuals or a specific people group that is harmful? Okay? So 3 answers obviously to this question. You can say yes, no, or I don't know. Spoiler alert, if you answer I don't know to any of these questions, I recommend you go back and read the work. I recommend you do a little bit of research. Like if you hear a scenario where it's like, oh, we're not supporting this author anymore, look into it. Do some research on your own. See why people feel that way. And that can really help you determine if you can separate their art from them, okay? So, yes, that is the very first question. If you answer yes, this person did say bad things about individuals or a people group, the next question you are going to want to ask yourself is, number 2, is this book considered a classic book? AKA, does it have merit in the literary world? Is it recognized as like a literary masterpiece or whatever? You might be going, well, we just talked about them saying bad things. What do classics have to do with anything? I promise it is relevant because the nature of it, I hate this as an excuse, but like times were different. It can sometimes be a legitimate excuse out of ignorance or whatever. But if it is considered a classic work, then we kind of go into some other questions, including if it's not a classic work, or if you answered no, this person didn't say any disparaging things about a people group. You move on to question 3. Question 3 is, did this author utilize the power that they gained from their literary accomplishments? Did they utilize it to abuse or take advantage of individuals or people groups? Or did they use that power to actively do harm to other people? So that is also a pretty important question if you're determining whether you should read an author or not. Maybe you shouldn't be supporting people who are actively harming other people. So that's an aside. Like I said, this chart by itself is not a question of this is a good person or a bad person. We don't care about that. But I don't think it's a bad question to ask yourself if they're not. So that's just me, maybe. That's just me. We've got, are they utilizing power to essentially just be terrible people? So, for the, are they doing bad things to people? If you answered yes, you're going to move on to question number 4. Question number 4 is the author still profiting from their works? It can also kind of be a question most of the time of, is this author still alive? Because I want to say there are very, very few authors that are still living that are like, I'm done receiving profits from these books. Maybe that's just me. You can tell me about exceptions below. But basically, the big question is, does this author still directly profit from writing these books? If the answer is yes, and you have already answered the fact that they're saying bad things or they're doing bad things to people, then we get to our very first answer. Our very first answer, bonk, right there. If the author is both doing terrible things to people or saying terrible things about people or spreading misinformation or blah, 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 whatever you want to say, if they're still actively doing that and they're making money from what they are doing, who knows what they're going to do with that money? There's a lot of moral and ethical kind of questions with that, and moral and ethical questions that also have a direct impact on people. Like, probably the people groups that they're talking shit about or doing shit to. So, therefore, because there's still like active consequences to basically paying for these books and or merchandise, depending on how big the book series is, we get our first answer, which is you cannot separate the art from the artist in this scenario. It's got real life consequences. You may not like those consequences, you may choose to ignore those consequences, but you can't say this is a scenario where you can separate the author from their work, okay? So, After I'm done reviewing this chart, I will give you guys like solutions. If you still are wanting to consume work that maybe is written or created by really, really terrible people, I'll give you solutions. I'm happy to do that because I know there is definitely an element of nostalgia for things like Gaiman and J.K. Rowling's books. So speaking of, I have a few example books here. The two I pulled for this cannot, which is basically the author can put their money into whatever want and actively continue to harm other people. My two example books. We have Harry Potter, this whole series, obviously. J.K. Rowling is actively doing harm to trans people all over the world because she just hates them. So like a lot of her donated money, and she's been open about this, a lot of her donated money is specifically going to anti-trans organization and is also big time supporting anti-trans legislation in the United Kingdom. So do with that information what you will. And of course, so you can elect to read that article if you wish, but basically Gaiman was using the power that he has collected from being ultra rich because of the sales of his books and doing terrible things to women and then basically like paying them off to not mention it to anyone. That's as much as I'm gonna get into with that. Once again, you can read the article if you are interested. But yeah, his money actively going to places that are harmful, as is any of both of their movies. So either J.K. Rowling or Neil Gaiman, both of their movies are actively profiting them. Any merchandise, stuff like that, actively profiting them. And I said this isn't a question about good or bad. This is the one scenario where I'm like, yeah, this is 100% like a good or bad thing. If they're actively profiting either off of saying things or doing things with their own like resources and money and power, that is a scenario where you cannot separate the art from the artist. Okay, let's get the hard one out of the way first, okay? Now, that being said, question number 5. Question number 5 is a question that should be asked either if you answered yes to the work being classic, if you answered no to did the author do anything horrible, or if you answer no, the author is not currently profiting off of their work. Okay? Then we can push over to question number 5. Question number 5 is, does the work have historical significance? So we're getting a lot less into the moral consequences of things. This is genuinely, now we're getting into the question of, can you separate the work from the artist? Okay? So for historical significance, once again, if you answer, I don't know if it has any historical significance, do some research. Research is a wonderful thing to do. I love doing it. I do it in my free time. So if you don't know, do some research. If it is historically significant though, you answer yes, that becomes a scenario where you cannot separate the writings from the author. Because their lived experience in that historical context, or if they're writing about other people's experiences, the active dwelling on, expanding on experiences that you have lived absolutely makes the author's point of view extremely relevant to the work and makes it pretty much inseparable. Makes the author and the writing pretty much inseparable. So, some examples I have for you, okay? These are both ones that, these are both ones that do say not great things within the pages of the book. They both are classics though, and they both have historical significance. So, the first one is basically what a lot of people describe as like literary work that most reflects the 1920s. The Roaring Twenties, if you will. A lot of us studied it in US schools. A lot of stuff like that. That's The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. I think it's a really, really excellent book. F. Scott Fitzgerald absolutely was racist. And I'm not justifying that. With any of these questions, if you morally, like, feel uncomfy reading the works, or if you have, like, trouble not thinking about the author when you're reading the works, that's okay. You don't have to read them. That is totally fine. No one's gonna be mad at you. Please don't read them if they make you uncomfortable. Excellent. But this is quite literally about living in the 1920s. F. Scott Fitzgerald's experiences in the 1920s directly impact how he wrote this book. Excellent. Very cool. Therefore, you cannot separate the art from the artist. Now, in another scenario, one of my favorite books, despite some very questionable content, it's Dracula. Surprise, surprise. It's Dracula. I adore this book. I think it's great. Can I also look at it and say it says like some really, really not great, very racially based things about the Romani people? Absolutely. Absolutely I can. But, I mean, this book quite literally takes place during the time period where Bram Stoker, the author, was living. There's a lot of aspects of the plot that directly impact. So for instance, the treatment of women in real life that I'm sure he witnessed directly translates to both how the characters Mina and Lucy are treated in this book. So, I could talk about Dracula all day. If you've been here before, you know I can talk about Dracula all day. But that being said, this is one that is definitely directly impacted by societal whatever during the time it was written. If you've made it to the question of does this work have historical significance though, and you actually answer no, because maybe it doesn't. Maybe it's a high fantasy novel that is not set within the world. Maybe it's whatever. This is where the questions kind of get a little tricky because I think this is where you could start making arguments like, yes, this is a sci-fi novel, but it is directly in response to a historical event that happened. The clouds are going over the sun again. So I guess it's just going to be cloudy now. Regardless though, if you somehow can answer no to this question, you move on down to the sixth and final question, which is, does this work explicitly express opinions held by the author? Uh-oh, spoiler alert, if it does, you cannot separate the art from the artist. So, my example books that I have got for you today, I brought a satire because I think satire is a very important one to discuss when it comes to does this express opinions explicitly held by the author. So, first one I brought, American Psycho by Bret Easton Ellis. This is quite literally a parody of Wall Street Journal men. And Bret Easton Ellis worked on Wall Street, and he has very strong opinions about these men. He feels as though they are evil, essentially. So, it does also directly draw on his experiences. That's what I mean when I say, like, it kind of gets questionable when we get into these other questions. And I do think with pretty much every book, you can make an argument that it is historically significant in certain ways, because at the end of the day, reading is political. And a lot of books that are released during certain time periods are often in direct response to historical events. So, but it's very clear that this is a satire about men that Bret Easton Ellis has like very much met before and has a lot of strong opinions on. So, of course, we're answering yes, and therefore you cannot separate the art from the artist, especially for American Psycho. Whoa. And then the other one I have, The Hunger Games by Suzanne Collins. Also one directly historically significant in my opinion, but we're going to use it in the hypothetical sense that there's no historical significance. There is still absolutely political opinion set forth by the author Suzanne Collins about media and about the depiction of how we view violent acts and about a bunch of things. I love this book. I do think it will eventually belong up in the classics category, by the way. It's also, like, it's a book definitely designed for, like, middle grade readers, but it's also pretty explicitly political. Pretty explicitly, you can tell what Suzanne Collins is thinking when she's writing this and why she chose to write it. And, of course, you can't think of The Hunger Games as an entity without thinking of Suzanne Collins and her opinions and the things she was trying to express to her audience, okay? But let's go back to the final question. Does this work have opinions explicitly expressed by the author? I have example books that I'm kind of hesitant to show you. I also think that these can exist, but I do think they primarily exist in the form of, like, children's books. Like, very, very young books. That, I mean, they don't have historical significance. They don't express opinions by the author. They, like, a bunch of stuff like that. I think this category very much, the only category you can separate the art from the artist is books that don't have historical significance or opinions by the author. Which, I think once you're past a certain point in reading, that's all you're gonna find. So I have some, like, archetypes of examples. I don't necessarily think that these books don't have opinions by the author within them, like heavily involved with them. But they're kind of more archetypes of like, okay, maybe you could make an argument for that. I did pick up The Hobbit. I picked up The Hobbit only because it's just like, you can say it's a fun little adventure novel, and it's got cool world building. And it is definitely a book that is a little more aligned with children. Once we get into The Lord of the Rings, I think it gets a little bit more heavy-handed in its symbolism and stuff like that. But it is one that I would say, like, a type of story that I would say could be deemed as without major opinions and without historical significance. The Hobbit, once again, not a great example of books that don't have historical significance, because he definitely wrote this in response to being involved in World War I. You see what I mean? Like, it's really hard. There's not a lot of books focused on adults that you can separate either historical significance or opinion from. So, another one that I thought of, just a good old romance novel. But I picked up Emily Henry because, first of all, it's been a while since I've read this, but I mostly picked up Emily Henry because it's just kind of like a romance novel. It's just kind of a fun read. I think there are definitely opinions expressed by Miss Henry in this book that feature predominantly in this book. So that's why I say not a great example. But I originally picked up Bridgerton because I was like, this is one that I think could pass. And then I remembered that Bridgerton is very much a series that is about marriage equality. Doesn't necessarily have anything about marriage equality between races or between same-sex scenarios, but it is definitely a critique on classism and stuff like that. So that's what I'm saying. Like, separating the art from the artist gets really, really hard if, once again, they have significant opinion by the author in them or historical significance. So, anyway, I made this little chart for you, basically just to tell you that there is very rarely times where you can completely separate the art from the artist. And you hate to hear it, and I know you hate to hear it because I also hate to hear it, because there are definitely, I can see why people would want to build on nostalgia that they had for books they loved when they were kids. And we have come to learn that we're not written by good people. I completely get that. But, once again, not all of these things are bad. Of course, this one right here, where if the author is still profiting, is a scenario where it's like, okay, this is where we should not engage with this media to a certain point. But, it can still be a good thing that a work has historical significance. I mean, if you think about Pride and Prejudice, that's just a lovely love story, but it's about classism and British culture and a bunch of stuff like that. Not stuff that's inherently bad. As far as I know, Jane Austen was a decent human being. Or we could get into the whole, yes, it does contain opinions, big opinions by the author. The Hunger Games is one of my favorite book series of all time. Does it heavily feature opinions by the author? Yeah, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. I don't think she's saying anything crazy. So, yeah, that's what I got. Anyway, as I said, we're gonna go back to the whole it becomes morally questionable to support them kind of answer, because I do want to give you guys some solutions to it. If you really are just having a difficult time divorcing yourself from something like that, for instance, Neil Gaiman for a long time was one of my favorite authors. I'll never say that again, probably. But for a long time, I just loved his work. The Graveyard book is one of my favorites. And thankfully, I already own them. In a scenario where you want to read a book, like if someone's been recommending you read Harry Potter, but you don't want to support J.K. Rowling, get it from the library. The library is a great resource. I adore the library. I talk about the library literally every video. But it's a great way to both support a public program that helps a lot of people without supporting the author of the works. I actually get a lot of classic books from the library because I don't know if I necessarily want to own them depending on their contents, but the library is the great place. Now, if we've gotten into the scenario of the library and you're like, wow, I really, really liked that book, but I still don't want to give money to the author, what should I do? You can buy them secondhand. You can see if your friend is like, I'm trying to get rid of these, I want to give them to someone else, you can try and get them that way. Basically, just buy used. Please don't buy new, if you can help it. Used book money does not go straight to the authors. Now, and then we get into kind of, let's talk Harry Potter. Yikes. Let's talk Harry Potter, because that is kind of, I won't say it's an exception, but it is an incredibly marketable series. And there is a lot of money in that world, in that realm, that is made pretty much exclusively through media deals or merchandise. If you find that you need to, like, you've got a young child in your family who just loves Harry Potter and wants a Harry Potter related gift, and you don't necessarily want to explain to that young child, like, oh, I can't give money to this woman because she's an evil person. I get that. I completely get that. There are tons of small businesses that sell merchandise. This is for pretty much any book series that you're looking for. Tons of small businesses sell merchandise. Those small businesses don't necessarily have to pay to the author when they're essentially just making and selling fan art, which is great. Buy from small businesses. Stimulate the economy. We go back to there's a lot of good you can do without giving money to someone who's going to inevitably do that with bad, like give the money to bad things. So yeah, so there are ways to get around it. As for if you choose to engage in fandom spaces, or you choose to be around people who still very much love the series and kind of have the same opinion of they don't give money to the author anymore, that is your prerogative. I will let you decide. I know plenty of people in fandom who were like, using Harry Potter as an example again, who were like, I decided to completely leave that fandom. I don't interact with it. I don't participate in it at all. That's fine. A lot of people I know still also make fan art or write fan fiction or stuff like that, kind of commandeer their own narrative of the books. That's also great. At the end of the day, it's kind of a situation in this scenario, in the scenario of the author is a bad person and we probably shouldn't give money to them. You're an adult. At least I assume you're an adult if you're watching the video. If you're not an adult, I guess you can still watch this video. This is probably a helpful thing to learn when you're young. But regardless, you're an autonomous person. You can make your own choices. I would love to encourage you not to give money to people who are actively harming, like a lot of people. And I know I've been talking a lot about gaming or rolling. Those are just the two very predominant ones. But if there are other ones that you think of, this still applies to them. You choose what you are comfortable with and what you are not comfortable with. This is the only outcome where it's kind of a moral question, and I cannot answer this for you. I mean, I literally made this graph just to be like, can you separate the art from the artist? And the reality is, most of the time, you really cannot. And it's not necessarily something that someone wants to hear, but there are also like really, really cool examples of like the direct influence of the author's lived experiences. You know what I mean? I mean, one of my favorite essays of all time, it's a satirical essay. It's A Modest Proposal by Jonathan Swift that literally satirizes what people were saying about Irish people in a time period where they were severely, severely abused. But yeah, so this is not a good or bad thing. You can choose. The one moral question you've got is right there. You can choose what that means to you. I do sincerely hope you are actively trying to be a decent person, actively trying to avoid harm done to people, but I can't stop you. Do be considerate of the authors you are picking up. I do think it's also very fun to do research on the authors you're reading, even if it's just like what opinions are being expressed by the author in this work. I mean, there's a reason why book clubs exist, or why your English teacher when you were younger sat you down and asked you questions about the work you were reading. It's a good time. I hope this chart was helpful to you. I hope this video was helpful to you. If you have any thoughts, if you think I should add any other questions, if you have a solution to not supporting authors monetarily, stuff like that, please comment down below. If you have any examples of any books that would fit into any of these categories, please let me know. Tell me a book that you think you can separate the art from the artist in. My personal opinion, I think you can separate. I personally can separate. I don't think Dr. Seuss was a great guy, but he's no longer living, and I don't think about the things he was doing if I'm reading something like Green Eggs and Ham. So, Green Eggs and Ham is my selection, but if you have one, please let me know. I don't know if anybody in the Northern Hemisphere is also experiencing this, but where I am, the snow is finally melting and the sun is finally coming back out. So, go outside and stand in the sun for a few minutes. And of course, go visit and support your local libraries. I will see you all later. Goodbye!